Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good morning again, tenants and tenant associations. My name is Johanna Shreve. I am the Chief Tenant Advocate of the Office of the Tenant Advocate. And I'm here to welcome you to this year's summit. As I began to prepare my remarks for this morning, I realized that I needed to ensure that what I said resonated with my audience. Why are you here? What role do we play in your lives? How can we help you to make a difference in the fight for affordable housing, which, by the way, is in a state of crisis? Every paper in the nation today has an article about the shortage of affordable housing. In the states of California, Oregon, New York, and elsewhere, the word crisis emanates. And what does the word crisis really mean? Well, if we start with a pure definition from Webster, it states that the word crisis is a noun that can serve as a turning point for better or worse in an acute disease or fever, a paroxysmal attack of pain, distress, disordered function, an emotionally significant event or radical change of status in a person's life, like a midlife crisis, an unstable or crucial time or state of affairs in which a decisive change is impending, especially one with the distinct possibility of a highly undesirable outcome like a national housing crisis. A situation that has reached a critical phase, like the lack of affordable housing. Together today, we have gathered to discuss this crisis. As your government agency, we have hopefully created a series of presentations that are focused on your current housing situation, but that are also intended to prepare you for the work ahead. Several months ago, I was invited to attend a session in New York to discuss the topic of third-generation rent control. I am a firm believer that rent control can help to redesign Washington's affordable housing landscape. But in order to do that, it will take a great deal of persistence, determination, and collaboration between you, the tenants of this city, and us, the agency that is tasked with protecting your housing needs. Last night, at the request of WHUR's Daily Drum, I and one of my attorney advisors sat in a studio to listen to the issue of the housing affordability crisis here in the city. We talked a great deal about the current situation, and then the lines were open for residents of the city to ask us questions. One of the callers stated that the rent is too high for us single-family mothers. Another said when it is all said and done, affordable housing is still unaffordable. What that means to me as I traveled home was that the situation was far more complex than just how much rent somebody pays. It included fees, utilities, unanticipated expenses as well. Today's meeting is the beginning of a new day for tenants in the city. It requires each and every one of you to truly pay attention. We have devised the programs today to be inclusive of your thoughts, and as such, we'll ask you to tell us how you feel about the issues before this audience. I believe that it is vitally important that we hear your voice, so we invite you to tell us through our video booth what rent control means to you. We ask you to participate in polling before each session so that we can get a reading on what matters to you, or also to find out what you currently understand about a specific topic. We included a session on the revised regulations for rent control and what that session is, and we will not get into the weeds as we call them. So we often want to make certain that you always remember that if you do not know the rules, you cannot play the game. The call to become a part of the new tenement movement culminates today. It is a time for action. It is a time for the city leaders to know that tenants demand a place at the decision-making table. The future of housing in this city has been accomplished in large measure without your input. But it is my hope that after today, that will change. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, remember, keep your thoughts positive because your thoughts become your words. Keep your words positive because your words become your behavior. Keep your behavior positive because your behavior becomes your habits. Keep your habits positive because your habits become your values. And keep your values positive because your values become your destiny. I hope as your government agency that we achieve the design program goals, which are to inform, to educate, to get to know each other better, to listen to what everyone has to say. If we are able to achieve these 4 ideals, we will have successfully achieved our goals. I now ask you to write down 1 or more goals that you seek to achieve today, which will then provide you with the ability to know whether or not you got anything out of the session. Now the fun begins. I will be asking each of you to respond to several questions. And in order to respond, in the center of each table, you will find a clicker. You see those clickers? I now ask you to pick up a clicker. Okay, now, let's pick them up. Don't be afraid. Throughout the day, you will be called upon to provide us with your opinion or answers to a variety of questions. And these questions will be posed before each presentation, and the results will be flashed upon the screen and monitors throughout the room. It is our way of getting you involved in each and every presentation of the day, and it will help us to evaluate whether or not that presentation is worthy of future trainings. So I will have the pleasure of starting you off now. Question number 1. Please tell us what ward you represent today. 1 through 8. If you do not live in the city, we ask you to use number 9 on your clickers. You got 20 seconds. Let's go. You got your clickers?
And you know where I live. Yeah, you know what we is. Sometimes you gotta stay in. Welcome to my house. Baby, take control now. We can't even slow down. We don't have to go a while.
Okay, I hope everybody put their answers in. Now you see. Of course, now I got to say it's in front of me. 8% from Ward 1. 6 from 2, 12 from 3, 14 from 4. It's about an even split. I don't live in the city, 13%. Okay. 9% in Ward 8, 8% in Ward 7. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. Question number 2. When did the U.S. government pass the first rent stabilization law? You've got answers from 1 to 4. Please select your answers. Your time starts now. Okay, you lodged your answer? 5% said 2010. 49% said 1985. 32% said 1919. And 14% said 1922. And the answer is 1919. Okay? You're going back to school today, people. You're going back to school today, people. Okay, the final question for me is, when does DC have to renew the Rental Housing Act of 1985? 20 seconds.
You can count on me like 1, 2, 3, I'll be there. And I know when I need it, I can count on you like 4, 3, 2, and you'll be there. 'Cause that's what friends are supposed to do.
Okay. Well, now, looks like people are waking up. Because you did get this answer right. Give yourself a round of applause. For those of you who have attended summits in the past, you know that normally we've had breakout sessions. But because the seriousness of what we have to face in 2020 is so important to everyone, I wanted everybody in the same room. I wanted everybody to be able to listen and talk to one another and hear what people had to say. And for us, sometimes the job is more than we can handle. We have been doing some podcasts, which will be talked about today, but we've been doing those with a gentleman who is at the top of his game. His name is Derek McGinty. Derek is a journalist, an award-winning interviewer, and a commentator. And he's worked with WHUR, WAMU, and other radio stations throughout his career. Sometimes I used to see him at McDonald's when I'd go there on Fridays. After several years in New York, he was an anchor on ABC's World News. And we are very, very, very delighted to let you know that he, this year, is the host of the Office of the Tenant Advocate Summit. And it was with a great deal of pleasure that I asked the brother to come on up. Did I do you well?
Well, Ms. Reed, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. I was hoping you forgot about the Big Macs from many years ago down on Georgia Avenue. Welcome again, everybody. Thanks so much. I want to thank Ms. Reed for starting on time because we got a big day. We have a lot of things in store for you. And again, my name's Derek McGinty. This is the 12th Annual Tenant and Tenant Association Summit. We're going to have some inspiring conversations. We're going to learn a lot, and hopefully you're going to have a little bit of fun as well. Now, as Ms. Shreve mentioned, for the last part of this year, I've been working on a webinar series, which is going to be online very soon. And in doing that, I've come to appreciate just how critical OTA is for DC and for you. As a local guy, I'm glad they're here. And I'm going to be very much appreciative of the work they do. We want to talk about affordable housing today, but more than that, we want to talk about solutions to the problems. So also, we got a little housekeeping I want to take care of very quickly. We are recording this whole thing. So turn your cell phones off. Your freaky ringtone will not entertain anybody today. We've got video cameras in the lobby. We want to record your thoughts on today's topic. So at the end of the day, we'll play some of your comments right here on the big screen. We'll be taping you until 2 o'clock. So if you have something to say, please make your way over there. And speaking of things to say, we've got note cards on the table as well. You'll note, so if you have questions after any presentations, write your question on the card. A volunteer will pick it up and bring it to the moderator. The most important thing, of course, is the restrooms. They're out the door to the left down the hall. They're easy to spot. And after the first 2 sessions, box lunches will be provided in the lobby. And we'll have volunteers on hand. If you are elderly or disabled, somebody will bring a lunch to you. First, though, let's get this thing started. We've got a presentation for you from OTA lawyer Sean Trainer. Now, a lot of you were freaked out by the idea that rent control is actually 100 years old. Well, Sean Trainer is going to come up here and sort of give us an idea of how it all came together. And we even got him dressed for the part. Come on up here, Sean.
Thank you all. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Thank you all for being here today. Almost 100 years ago, on a beautiful June afternoon in 1921, a sniper was lying in wait in the middle of Thomas Circle. He was waiting for the junior senator from Delaware, Lewis Heisler Ball, waiting to kill him. Senator Ball had been receiving death threats for almost 2 years, but not from militant communists or Italian anarchists who were the usual suspects when a politician got shot back then. No, it was DC landlords who had been sending him hate mail by the bushel. Hold on, why is this just playing without me clicking? Can we fix that? Can we go back? He'd been receiving hate mail by the bushel from DC landlords. And that was because he had been fighting for the last 2 years to keep this city affordable for tenants like you. So to understand why that would-be assassin was lying in the grass, we need to pull the camera back. We'll leave him there in Thomas Circle for the moment and look at back to 1903. That's when Senator Ball first got to Washington. Now imagine you were a tenant in 1903. You may have lived in an alley dwelling. A lot of tenants did. And what I mean by that is that your house opened up on an alley, not the street. The alley was usually blocked or closed on one side, and it made each alley kind of a little village. And that's actually the form of segregation we had back then, not geographic, but alleys and street-facing houses. You probably didn't have running water or electricity, but you did have a coal oven to keep warm in the winter. Your doors probably didn't have locks, but you did have neighbors who looked out for each other. The alley villages were not inviting to outsiders. This is where the term blind alley comes from. But there was a sense of community. Or maybe you could afford a little townhouse or an apartment in one of the fancy new apartment buildings if you were better off. Or you might have lived in one of the boarding houses scattered all over down the old city, which is what the part of the city inside Florida Avenue is called. Past that was open country mostly. This is Cleveland Park, 1903. You probably walked to work each day, and you walked home with enough money in your pocket to pay your rent. It's very unlikely you paid more than 20% of your income in rent. For most of American history, 20% was considered the number that was unmeetable, that was a scandal. It would make the papers if you were paying more than 20% of your rent. Now, if your landlord raised your rent, it's not like you had a lot of legal options. You had to pay or get out. But there was a lot of other housing available. Most of the land outside of Florida Avenue, like we saw, was still empty. New apartments and houses were going up all the time. There was somewhere to move to. I don't want to sound like this era was roses and smiles. Okay, it was segregated, it was drafty, it was smelly. But if you wanted to live in DC, you could afford to. Ball was only a senator for 2 years back then, but then he came back to the Senate in 1918. In those 15 years, Washington had transformed. That was because America got involved in what was, up till then, the biggest conflict in human history. We entered World War I in April of 1917. The US government went overnight from a second-rate regional power to trying to coordinate one of the biggest movements of men and material in history. The size of the government ballooned. The population of DC jumped a third in just that first year. DC had taken all the decades from the Civil War to 1900 for the population to grow by over 200,000. Now it would repeat that feat in just 3 years. And most of that increase was in 1 year. So if you were a tenant in 1918, DC was suddenly a very different place. There'd been a lot of new buildings built along the streetcar lines, but that all stopped when the war started. Construction totally stopped. You probably still lived in the same space, but your rent had doubled or tripled virtually overnight. Your wages had not gone up to keep pace. In fact, if you were black, which 25% of the city was, the highest percentage in the country, your wages had probably gone down because President Wilson had moved for the first time to impose Jim Crow on Washington and segregate the federal government. So there was a good chance that in the last 5 years, you'd lost your job as an accountant or a clerical worker, and what was open to you now was low-skilled, low-pay manual labor. This led to an incredible upheaval of society. Suddenly, families that had been in place for generations were out on the street. Those who stayed had to take in roomers to make rent. Where one family had lived, now there might be three, with ratty curtains separating their living spaces. Rents shot up in DC so fast that the federal government could not afford to pay its workers enough to live here. The first-year turnover rate in the Navy was over 50% that year. That means out of every 100 people the Navy hired, over 50 would in the first year realize they could not afford to live in DC, quit, and go home. At least that's what then Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt told Congress in a letter. Now, Congress did recognize there was a problem, and they got hard to work doing what Congress does best, calling each other names. Although, first, they did slap a Band-Aid on the problem with a resolution that put a moratorium on evicting tenants who'd been there when the war started. And this was better than nothing, but it had a lot of problems. For one thing, the law had been drafted in an incredible hurry, and nobody knew what it meant. The landlord couldn't kick you out, but could they sue you for the money in other ways if you didn't pay the crazy rent they demanded? Nobody knew. Here's an even bigger problem, though. It only applied to leases that have been in place when the war started. So if a landlord could get their tenant out, they were free to charge whatever they wanted, and there was no housing code. Now, who can guess what happens when the landlord realizes they can get double or triple the rent if they can just get you out of the unit? Has anyone here ever experienced something like that? Happening today. It was a recipe for harassment and neglect. Remember, most of these places were heated with coal furnaces. Landlords stopped delivering the coal, or they put padlocks on the stove so the tenants couldn't heat the places themselves. Now, tenants didn't take this lying down. They started to form tenants associations and DC's first tenant union, representing tenants from all parts of the city. And in partnership with local churches, who played a big role, they started pushing hard for a real solution. Now, everyone agreed something had to be done, but they couldn't agree on how. Congressman Johnson of Kentucky, who sat on the House committee that ran our government back then, decided his Senate counterparts must be corrupt because, I know you'll find this shocking, they wanted to put DC residents on the commission to set DC rents. He thought that anyone from DC must be a corrupt parasite who just wanted to suck off the government teat. You couldn't be trusted to police yourselves. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Reading between the lines, it seems like he was more interested in making fiery speeches than getting anything done. He got the Senate so angry with his accusations that they just refused to work on the issue for 2 years. They insisted the House kick him out. The House wouldn't do it. This shouting match lasted for 2 long years. The tenants' unions did succeed in pushing back against landlords here and there. And the newspapers are full of stories of tenants' associations and landlords having standoffs over furnaces, attacks on landlords who were coming to lock up the furnaces. Situations started to get violent. The tenant union and churches kept pushing on Congress, but we didn't have home rule back then, and Congress didn't much care to listen. In this whole 2-year struggle, Congress never solicited testimony from a single DC resident. Tenants cried, but without representation, they were howling from the wilderness. The stories from these days are heartbreaking. But maybe the saddest part is the grim harvest of the winter of 1918-19. Remember, the landlords were wriggling out of the law by turning off the heat, and 1918 was cold. It was cold, and the soldiers were coming back from war to a city packed like sardines. And with the soldiers was coming the most deadly virus in human history. Spanish flu, which killed more people in terms of total lives lost than any disease ever. No country or city was spared, but Washington was hit harder than almost anywhere in the US. In crowded apartments, with the heat turned off, flu turned into pneumonia. And pneumonia turned the city into a house of death. The city ran out of graves, then out of grave diggers. We actually ran out of coffins. We went so far as to requisition, meaning hijack, a train full of coffins on its way to Pittsburgh. In the middle of all this suffering, Congress went right on blaming us for the problem, without hearing from a single DC resident. Some congressmen said we could afford our rents if we just didn't eat so much ice cream. Does that sound familiar? Another threatened to move the capital from D.C. if we didn't somehow fix the problem. Now, that wave of death was just starting to burn itself out when Senator Ball came back to his old Senate seat. Ball was a medical doctor by training, and he was very concerned about public health. He'd gotten the Spanish flu himself, and he was about as different a personality from Johnson as you can get. I'm pretty sure you're going to hear more words from this stage today than he ever spoke to reporters in his entire political career. But he was a listener. I mean, just look at those ears. This quiet country doctor was given the duty of chairing the Senate subcommittee on D.C. rent, and he did something that no one else in Congress had done. He let Washingtonians talk directly to Congress. And boy, did Washington show up. Not just the tenant unions and the church leaders, but individual tenants risking savage reprisals showed up to tell their stories. Elderly couples left to freeze while dying of pneumonia. Women pushed into prostitution by unbearable rent demands. Sudden plunges from middle-class comfort into poverty from a single letter from the landlord. It filled the press for weeks and months. It became a national story. And for the first time, there was real pressure on Congress because it had become a national embarrassment. By now, D.C. society was in a crisis condition. That summer of 1919, while Congress was finally opening hearings, the same day they opened hearings, it seemed like social order might completely break down. In Europe, governments were collapsing as workers rioted over the cost of living, especially rents. The King of Romania was stabbed twice in one of these riots. There was a huge surge of political violence here as well on the part of left-wing radicals. Most dramatically, that's the house of then Attorney General Palmer, who was suicide bombed by an Italian anarchist calling for class revolution. Now, just weeks later, that Attorney General would be campaigning for rent control as a way to blunt the calls for revolution. Now, on the same day the hearing started, one of the most violent race riots in American history broke out in D.C. It started with returning white veterans attacking blacks in Southwest over a perceived threat to the honor of white women. It was a riot that pitted white veterans against their black counterparts, with attacks on pedestrians and streetcar passengers. Egged on by calls for a cleanup operation in white-owned papers, like the Washington Post, it climaxed in an attempt to smash and clear blacks out of Shaw completely. That might sound like I'm exaggerating, but it's exactly what happened 2 years later in Omaha. In this case, though, veterans of the D.C. National Guard showed up. They fought a pitched battle against the rioters. Can you slow down they pitched battle against the rioters, which climaxed in a barricade all the way from Mount Vernon Square to Shaw, to the other end of Shaw, and a pitched shooting battle. When it turned against the police and the rioters, who you couldn't tell apart because they were all in uniform, the Army finally sent in the cavalry to take control of the situation. Like the Spanish flu, Washington kind of tried to sweep this under the rug, forget about it. But in Chicago, riots happened on the same day and over the same period of time, and they did make an effort to study the cause of the riots. The conclusion of this commission was that housing pressure was the primary factor. Frustrated white people who couldn't afford to live in Chicago were taking out their rage on their perceived black competitors for apartment space. And there's every reason to think the same dynamic was at work here. Regardless, with that violent summer, with the dramatic testimony of Washingtonians, and with a senator willing to bring it to Congress, D.C. could no longer be ignored. The Ball Rent Act passed Congress on October 22nd and became a law on October 2nd and became law on October 22nd. Now, just a brief word on what that law actually looked like. The first rent control law set up a commission made of D.C. residents. That commission would have the power to look into any proposed rent increase and decide if it was fair. The landlord was guaranteed a 6% return on investment. Nowadays it's 12%. But beyond that, the commission would look at all the facts and circumstances to figure out if the increase was for legitimate expenses or just an attempt to gouge the tenant. It also said, for the first time, that the landlord had to have a good reason to evict their tenant. Either the tenant had to not pay the legal rent, or break a term of the lease, or the landlord had to be updating the property or need it for personal use. Now, if you're familiar with our rent control laws today, those are the same exceptions we have. Eviction only for good cause. It looked a heck of a lot like the rent control we have today. Oh, and it gave us a housing code. No more turning off the heat to get rid of your tenant. As you can imagine, landlords were not happy and organized themselves to try to get the law thrown out in the courts. The fight went right up to the Supreme Court. And in April of 1921, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote this: "The space in Washington is necessarily monopolized in comparatively few hands, and letting portions of it is as much a business as any other. Housing is a necessary of life." These are the two sides of the coin. All the elements of a public interest justifying a degree of public control are present. The Supreme Court, for the first time, had upheld rent control as a constitutional exercise of government power, and it opened the door for rent control all across the United States. Rent control in some form was here to stay. There would be rent control somewhere in the US from that point forward, but not in DC. You see, landlords around the country understood what was at stake. They understood that the eyes of the nation were on DC, and so they organized nationwide to fight it. And this is the birth of the National Real Estate Lobby and of the Builders Lobby. When the court blessed rent control in 1921, and there's the court in 1921, Senator Ball was already pushing through an extension with his local allies, and he was already getting death threats. In June of 1921, just a few months later, he got the extension passed. Under this new law, the big change was that landlords who overcharged rent would have to repay the tenant for the rent they overcharged, not just stop charging it in the future, and this infuriated a lot of people, including J.P. Morgan, who gave a lot of angry speeches about it. For the nameless sniper we started the story with, this was apparently the last straw. A few days after that vote, he watched as Ball came down Mass Avenue in his car and opened fire. Ball never saw the sniper, but he heard the shot, and he sped away as fast as he could over street and sidewalk. It wasn't until he got home that he realized that the bullet had gone through the driver's side car door and torn a hole in his pants, missing him by millimeters. By the way, do you see that word Solon that it calls him? After Solon gets warning letters, it's a term of respect. Solon the lawgiver was, we used to use it for senators and other lawmakers back, I guess, in a more respectful age. Solon was the framer of the first democracy back in ancient Greece, and that word goes to show the respect that locals had for Senator Ball. Now, the assassin failed to kill Solon Ball or to stop rent control. We got it extended in 1921 and 1923. But the real estate lobby was learning to use more powerful weapons. The next time it came up in 1924, Ball was shocked when he opened his hearings to see dozens and dozens of unfamiliar faces. Lawyers and realtors and builders had showed up from Chicago, New York, California, across the country to drown out the local voices calling for rent control. A whole throng of lobbyists used pressure on their local senators to get on the witness list. And there were so many landlord-side witnesses that it pushed the hearings on and on and on for a year. It was a filibuster of testimony, basically, and it worked. The bill got pushed back to being considered in 1925, which was a big problem because Ball had lost re-election to mega millionaire Alfred DuPont. He did not give up. He went to President Coolidge to try to work out some kind of DC rent control by executive order, but that didn't take off. Once it was clear rent control was going to die, he got himself appointed to be DC's last rent commissioner so he could write the agency's final report. And it is a bitter repudiation of the special interests, shaky math, and legal maneuvering used to kill rent control. It ends with a dire warning about what the city will look like without tenant protections. The next Congress talked about extending rent control, but guess what? They didn't hold any further hearings with local Washingtonians. We were shut out again. And on June 22nd, 1925, rent control ended. But not forever, of course. So let's pull the camera back one more time and look over the rest of the 20th century and our long march to housing justice. Business-friendly local papers had predicted the free market would take care of everything once we got rid of rent control. Well, that didn't happen. Decent housing became less and less affordable, and just a few years later, the Great Depression hit, and DC became a city of tents. I say a city of tents because vast amounts of open space in the city were teeming with tent cities of homeless people called Hoovervilles, after then President Herbert Hoover. World War I veterans set up this entire tent city in Anacostia, all along the river, but there's hardly a patch of green in this town that didn't have people living in tents on it. The government response was brutal. Hoover called in the army to push the homeless out of town with cavalry and tanks. The army crossed into Anacostia, guns blazing, and lit the largest of the camps on fire. It was outrage over this atrocity in large part that helped sweep FDR into office in 1932. He'd been a big booster of rent control back in 1919, one of the people pushing Congress to do it. But his attempts to get it reinstated in D.C. took a long time. There were so many crises during the Great Depression. It was hard to get Congress to convince that rent in D.C. was a national emergency. But that changed when the Nazis took Paris in 1940. That was a huge psychological shock to the whole country, and it became clear that a new emergency was here, and a new buildup would be necessary. For the first time in 15 years, Congress consulted with the local population, and we showed up in droves. Now, the landlords did too, but this time their concerted efforts were countered not just by the tenant unions, who were still around, and the churches, and brave tenants, but also by the political power of the national labor unions, who came together to support DC rent control and show up in force. With the president pushing hard and local Washingtonians speaking up, DC managed to get rent control through before any other city, before we entered the war. Round two of rent control in DC passed on December 2nd, 1941. It was the last thing Congress would do before declaring war on Japan. Talk about the nick of time. DC rent control became the model then that nationwide rent control was based on. That didn't mean there wasn't a housing crunch in DC. There definitely was. It became something of a national punchline. There were even Hollywood comedies about it. Actually, there were a lot of them. In fact, I thought it might be fun to look at a clip from one of these movies from 1943, So This Is Washington. Whoop. We got capacity to play that? Well, it'll be available on our website. It's, believe me, you're not here for the clip. It's a little slapstick. These guys are trying to find a place to stay. They get offered a basement with pipes and no windows, and then the hotel manager goes and takes it himself because he has nowhere to stay. It's, 40s slapstick. As you can see, DC was incredibly overcrowded, but it was something that could be laughed about. Because Congress had acted before total crisis struck, we didn't have the same kind of social breakdown that we did in World War I. There were no outbreaks of mass death, no massive civil disturbances. Life was hard, but life did go on. And rent control, again, was supposed to be a temporary measure, but we showed up again and again to keep it going. In 1945, in 1947, in 1949, in 1951, DC residents showed up in droves to demand Congress keep rent control going. Now that changed when Dwight Eisenhower became president. In his very first State of the Union, he called for the end to all federal price controls. But he did make an exception for rent control, which he thought local communities should be able to decide on, and that rent control should be maintained until local communities could decide if they wanted to keep rent control. In that same speech, he called for home rule. To give locals a chance to decide and give DC a chance to decide, rent control kept getting extended until 1955. But while every other city and state in the country got a chance to vote on it, DC was denied a vote. Why? Well, that's down to one of the villains of this story, Representative McMillan of South Carolina. He was a tobacco planter who saw any extension of rights to D.C., which was by now majority black, as setting a dangerous precedent in the Jim Crow South. He was a signer of the Southern Manifesto, vowing to resist integration at any cost. When Walter Washington, who was the first black D.C. commissioner and later our first mayor, presented his budget to Congress, McMillan responded by sending back a wagon full of watermelons. I hope it's clear where McMillan stands in the eyes of history. Eisenhower's plan had been to implement home rule and then give the newly elected D.C. government the choice of whether to keep rent control. Unfortunately, that stayed the plan. They got tied together, and so as McMillan blocked all efforts to put forward a home rule bill, rent control died with it. Home rule in D.C. with rent control would be introduced 10 times in Congress over the next 5 years. But he used all of his influence and power to kill it in committees. And the twin dreams of home rule and the power to control the cost of living in our own city would be deferred for the next 20 years. Because of all this, while everywhere else got the choice of whether to keep it, chuck it, or put in a transition plan, we just crashed right out of rent control. Rents shot up. People began to flee to the suburbs, those who could, and the city's population began a long decline that would last for half a century, for 50 years. Instead of local control and a choice of how to hold down rents, D.C. was forced to be the showcase for an urban renewal model that was supposed to revitalize impoverished American cities. Now, I think it's fair to say that this experiment was a disaster for D.C. For those who didn't live through it, here's a brief rundown. So-called slum areas, meaning poor and not always but usually black, were bulldozed. In theory, those people were going to be relocated to shiny new affordable housing developments, but those rarely materialized. Instead, the housing that was produced was totally unaffordable to the people cleared out. Okay, gentrification is not a new story. And a lot of the cleared clay was used to build our massive highway system, these highways. These highways cut off most of D.C. from the water, destroying the value of some of the best land in the city. Now, displaced residents of the cleared neighborhoods, if they could afford it, most of them ended up buying houses up in Northeast, and that's where a lot of that community in Northeast came from. If they didn't have the money, increasingly they were pushed to what was then the only low-cost high-rise apartments in the city in Anacostia. Anacostia, whose beauty and economy had been based on river access, was completely separated from the water by I-295 and became a zone of impoverishment behind an 8-lane wall. Now that's the legacy of DC's dream deferred by 20 years. But Washington did not just passively accept these 20 years of absentee landlordism from Congress. The fight for autonomy and affordable housing continued. By the way, I had to use that picture down there because the hippie in plaid is my dad. In 1961, activists fought for and got our right to vote for president. Leaders like MLK and Marion Barry elevated home rule into a national civil rights issue. And then, of course, there were the riots the night of Martin Luther King's assassination. Now, there's no doubt that they did terrible and lasting harm to our city and our communities, but they also did shock and frighten Congress into again getting serious about the demands of Washingtonians, much like the riots and unrest of 1919. The times were changing, and McMillan was on the wrong side of history. Congress took the extraordinary step of taking a bill, giving us our first delegate, who would be Walter Fauntroy, out of McMillan's committee. Walter Fauntroy then began a strategy of targeting vulnerable members of Congress to force their support for home rule. Finally, in 1972, 20 years after McMillan had blocked home rule for the first time, Fauntroy and other DC activists, maybe some of whom are here today, organized Washingtonians to open their wallets and go in person down to South Carolina to get the newly enfranchised black population there to jump party lines and vote in the Democratic primary to get McMillan out of what was supposed to be a no-contest primary. It worked. It worked. McMillan was out, and the very next year, Congress passed 2 bills in the same week at the urging of Washingtonians. One was the Home Rule Act, which gave us control over our own government for the first time in a century. The other, by the way, was authorization to pass rent control. And so, D.C. had its own government for the first time in over 100 years. And in 1975, D.C.'s first city council held hearings. D.C. showed up. You showed up for the first time to a government called to serve your needs first. You showed up, and in response, the Solons of our city passed rent control. And yeah, I would call them Solons. I'd use that old-fashioned word of respect for someone who makes wise law. In fact, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I want to pull the camera back one more time. Not 1 century, but 25. Because I want to make the point that while D.C. is unique, its problems are not new. So let's look back to another city that almost broke apart, that almost came to a civil war between landlords and tenants. Ancient Athens, 2,500 years ago. And that fellow Solon, whose name we give to wise lawmakers, was asked to mediate. Now Solon, who you can see up top of the Supreme Court building there next to Moses, he's remembered as the father of democracy. He introduced fundamental concepts we cherish in an age of tyrants. Trial by jury, the right to appeal, of course the right to elect your representatives regardless of wealth. He introduced to the ancient world the idea that the law should be more powerful than the ruler. But very few people seem to remember that these were all from Solon's second reform. The first thing Solon did when he was given power was roll back rents. He did this even though it wiped out his own fortune. But he said it was worth the price to build a good city. And he was asked, what would that even mean for a city to be good? And he gave this rather strange answer. If there was a city where people treated an injustice done to their neighbor as if it was done to themselves, that would be a city we can all live in. And I think that's something that still animates us here today. I think all of us are here today because we're hungry for a city we can live in. Everyone here wants a city that understands, in the words of Martin Luther King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. A city where no one is overlooked. I think we all share that goal. That was Solon's goal. That was Senator Ball's goal. It's the OTA's goal. I hope it's the goal of everyone in this room, a city we can all live in. And the fight for affordable housing continues. Of course, the question of how to make sure DC has room for people of all backgrounds and incomes is hard. But one of the tools DC has always chosen when given our own free choice is rent control. Rent control protects the long-term resident versus the wealthy newcomer. It protects the tenant aging in place. In short, it's something that shields the long-term DC community from the warping effect of so many people coming through here for a few years here and a few years there. And this is about more than just rent control. This is about making a city built for people to live in. And that puts you up against outside interests who see Washington as a city to work in, a city to make money in, not a city to live in. And those interests are not going anywhere. So your fight goes on. It went on in 1985 when you extended rent control and showed up at the ballot box to stop it from being phased out by vacancy decontrol. It went on when you abolished rent ceilings that had become rent traps. It went on in 2005 when Councilman Jim Graham and numerous tenant activists, some of whom are here with us today, inaugurated the Office of the Tenant Advocate to try to help ensure that our wonderful tenant protections in this city would be more than words on paper, that they would protect homes and preserve human flourishing. In 2020, the council is going to meet to consider whether to extend rent control, rent stabilization, and whether to make changes to it. The landlords and the developers, national and local, know their history. They will show up Will you? Will you show up? Will you show up and claim your inheritance? Will you claim the inheritance of a century of ceaseless struggle to make this place a city we can all live in? You are called to testify by those who sweat and bled and stood their ground, those who sang and marched and wrested a free city from the halls of power on the hill. You are called because the fight for a decent city to live in bequeathed you a local government that must listen when you speak. So speak. And if you testify, if you speak up for yourself, I truly believe you can make for us a city we can all live in. Thank you.
OTA Attorney Advisor Sean Trainer. I tell you, I lived here my whole life, and I did not know hardly any of that stuff. Thank you, Sean. That was tremendous.